with jacks, lifted the house, put them on the back of his truck, put the whole house on the back of his truck, and drove down that slope, you know, quite steep, and we certainly held our breath. But it was done, and we were able to erect it. But particularly what I certainly remember was the work going on from dawn, absolute dawn, to 10:30, 11 at night, and being incredibly not only tired but dirty, because the rain and there are sections of the soil which are reddish, volcanic soil, so that it was always difficult to get completely clean.
So where did you have your meals?
We had the meals in the farmhouse before, and then when it was shifted down again.
Still.
Yeah, well, and in very makeshift manner.
Yes.
It was a case of just whatever we could do. But fortunately, there were 2 or 3 women. Lorna, I'm not sure. I think Mary Bolsh didn't do that much because she was looking after the young children. But May Lundquist, Diana Snow, Lorna were the 3 essential women that.
And Joan is in Sydney with your kids, huh?
And Joan was in Sydney with the children.
What about them?
The Bruford, yeah, John and Joan. No, oh yes, that's a good point. Joan must have.
She must have helped.
Yeah, yes, although she was not.
Maybe she had to watch John.
Also, yes, and her age was, she was older than the others. I think. Well, I'm sorry.
Because
he was crippled. He had severe polio. Very crippled. But he was extremely strong in the top and his arms, and he did a tremendous amount of the woodwork inside Barbara's house, building the bed, the tabletop, Barbara's chair, and and Barbara's potty chair.
Really, he did that, not
Yeah, it was a combined effort. But all I know is that John was extremely strong and could, for example, sand and saw because of the strength of his upper torso.
How did the polio affect him? Was he like in a wheelchair?
No. But his one leg was shortened, and it had it was more than that. It was metal. I mean, in other words, there was a gap about that big, and he was.
Was he walking with a stick or?
He was.
His back was hunched over.
His back was hunched over.
But was he walking? Or?
Wait a minute. He was walking. He was walking. But gosh, I'm sorry, I can't remember now clearly. But obviously, with any distance, he would have used a stick and helped, definitely.
So short distance.
But short distance, yes. He could move around, in other words, and move from one end of the bench to the other, and so forth. But there was a small group. Jack Painter was a man like Roy Bolsh, you could say, that was strong, young, and happily joined in. But then again disappeared.
Baba just sent them for this work.
Baba sent him for that work. And what was, Francis was incredibly supportive and helpful, not only in terms of planning and deciding what, ultimately he was the leader, there's no question. And he would decide finally where the windows would go, the doors, or I mean the decisions and the purchase of the building in the first place. And apart from that, because he was already writing Stay With God. I'm not sure now, it could have been virtually finished, maybe not edited. There was maybe still a lot of work to be done, but a lot of it had been done. And he would, over meals, he would read passages, which was most helpful. It got our minds off the job and back to just Baba, and gave us fresh impetus to continue again.
How dedicated bunch. It's absolutely dedicated. Otherwise, nothing we would see today. You
And
don't know
only 3 months to do it.
It was quite incredible.
So did
And the team, I can't praise them enough. You know, that the way they worked. I mean, John Bruford, crippled, you know, with difficulty. Reg Paffel is not a carpenter, but had taught himself.
What about work? Like Reg worked in a hotel. Did
Yes.
he leave his job and come to do this
Yes,
the whole time?
yes.
And what about you? Where did you work? Did you leave your job?
Yes. Well, I was fortunate in the sense that that I was a psychologist in the army. I was a psychologist in the army in the first place in order to move from Melbourne to Sydney. And how handy that was, because I was able to organise my I don't know how I did, but anyway, I organised my transfer from Sydney, where I was working, to Brisbane in the army.
does that mean-
And then I was able to travel up so that I would come on the Friday and work through to Monday, taking leave, and then taking leave, paid leave, what was due to me, and unpaid, in order to work full time.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Man.
And again, I'm not
Used to physically.
I'm not used to constant physical work. I can do.
What about, you said you purchased the building, the shed, you know, you purchased the shed.
Yeah.
Is it like a fabricated one or?
Yes, it was prefab. Prefab. The whole thing is a kit. You put it together.
Bullshit.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah. So that what had to be done, of course, in the beginning, was to set out the stanchions, the stumps, determine and the position, which was the farmhouse was here and Baba's house is here.
We'll talk about that one later.
Yeah, we can, and I can show you where the, and I can, and as an indication of the details of the preparation, I can recall John Bruford and I set off in 2 cars on the Monday afternoon to travel to Brisbane to meet Baba and the Mundley and Francis. Francis went down earlier to meet Baba in Sydney,
Yes, because he was
and
in
then bring him up to Brisbane,
the airport.
to the airport. Now, John and I must have left sort of late-ish afternoon, in order to be down there because the roads were not. It took about 2.5 hours to get down to Brisbane. The roads were not roads as they are now.
One other question before you get there. Like Francis would have had to really gotten cleaned up and dressed up to get on a plane to go.
Yes.
"Okay, after being here, where's the shower here? Where do you get a shower?"
Well, our shower during the rainy season was a small waterfall from the top of the hill where we had constructed the road. I can show you the spot, and we would wash underneath there, and then after that it was a matter of a bucket of water and to do what you can. But what I'm getting at is that okay, we left sort of latish in the afternoon. I can recall asking Giff Alston, a barber lover from Melbourne, who had arrived, the day before or that day in preparation to be with Barbara, and I said to him, look, there's two stumps from the steps into the farmhouse. The stumps were still left, and they all had to be pulled out, and so the stumps were still being pulled out as we drove down to meet Barbara. Wow. Yeah, and I remember him complaining, how is it that you keep finding stumps that I have to pull out? Because you can imagine they were well embedded.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult to work them loose and get them out. Yeah. He was, fortunately, quite a strong man.
And it must have been a wonderful atmosphere. I mean, I'm thinking living in these conditions all together and working so hard, you must have had a wonderful feeling of family and unity.
Oh, there was. It was quite incredible how we all pulled together. And there was, again, like the preparation for 1956, how harmonious it was.
I think it looks like 3 months, 6 months work you guys finished in 3 months.
Yes, that's right.
Can we take a photo of all of us and then close this? Because Andrew is getting into red.
Yep,
so
righto.
Can you put in the self?
Anyway, that was interesting. Jay Barber. I think I've already spoken about the incredible excitement, the incredible amount of work that went into preparing Mayer House, the Beacon Hill House, before Barber's first visit, before he first set foot on Australian soil. And it's quite amazing when one thinks about it, that, as Barbara said, it wasn't the first thing that he said, but the first main statement that he made was, I've come to plant the seed of love in this country. And isn't it amazing? Isn't it wonderful to think that now, irrespective of the rise and fall of cities and governments and people and whatnot, that Barbara's love is there and growing and developing, opening up like a flower. It's so beautiful. And what's interesting too is that I've seen myself the development from the very beginning when I first read the discourses in 1947, and when I was, and being somewhat aware, you could say, of what Australia was then, the people then, the degree of spirituality. Not that I'm in a position to judge, I'm not, but it was certainly what was outward was the Christianity an Orthodox Christianity was the only visible sign of spirituality, and the belief was held that anything else that other than Christianity was heathenism. And it's so beautiful to think of how Baba came all that way, that distance, in order to plant the seed of love, and to think of what of the development of what will happen over the next 700 years. How wonderful! I wonder what I wonder what saints and maybe musts spring up on this soil of ours. Yes, it's an interesting thought. Anyway, so Baba, the day came, and I drove in the car that had been given to me, that I had carefully made sure was in good repair, and included a little mast screwed into the bonnet of the car, to which we attached a flag, Baba's flag, Mastery and Servitude. I had no idea. I'm horrified now to think that we might have got pulled up by the police, because we didn't have an authority to do that. Only diplomatic, prominent people were allowed to do that. But I think that we blithely drove through the city and the suburbs. I mean, it's quite a distance from the airport to Beacon Hill, showing this flag. And of course nothing happened, but how it would have been terrible if something had happened. So I drove in, and with the photographer, the cameraman with his, I suppose, 16mm film. I'm sorry, I don't know whether it was 16 or 35. But anyway, in order to get a good view of Baba descending from the plane, setting his foot on Australian soil, the cameraman and myself went up on the second floor of a nearby building and set ourselves up. And you see the result in the little 2-minute film that we took. Baba saw us and waved to us, which was in itself a joy for me, naturally. And it was such a joyous, welcoming wave from Baba. I could sort of visualize it now. Yeah, and then he disappeared into the terminal building, terminus, the terminal building, and then I drove the car to the entrance and waited for him to appear, and then when he did, I noticed how he greeted various people. There were a few of us there, not that many. There were a few, and it was curious how Baba seemed to know those that had come for him and those who hadn't, because there were others there waiting for other passengers. And then Baba came to the car, and to my horror now, I can't remember whether I was out of the car standing when he sat down, or whether I was seated. Probably, when I think of it, how careless that I was, that how little I was aware of the incredible significance of the Lord being there and getting and coming to the car. I should have been standing, but anyway, it just shows how immature and how limited I was in my perception, and yet there was no question I was his. And no matter what has happened in my life, that has not wavered. Yeah. So anyway, Barbara is in the car, and we set off. In the back seat, of course, is Erich, no doubt Auntie Senior, and probably Francis at that time.
Can I just ask, how did you feel, when you first saw him coming down the plane? All I can remember is an immense happiness, a joy of seeing him again. Joy rises so naturally. Not only, naturally when one sees him in person, but in the same way when one thinks of him, when one visualizes him, when one's being is concentrated on him, the underlying feeling is a joy. Which I don't know how would one define it. There's a happiness, a contentment, a sort of an aliveness, I think, as much as anything. So I started driving, very intent, but I must have glanced at Barbara. Anyway, we'd only gone a very short distance, and Barbara said, "All right, you're a good driver, but keep your eyes on the road." And sitting next to you in the front.
oh yes, I'm sorry. Barbara was seated on a bench seat alongside me, and of course I was very aware of him being there. But from that time on, I did keep my eyes religiously on the road, because I wanted to obey him, no matter what the order was or the circumstances. So we drove, and I don't remember anything. What the only thing I can tell you was that with the various times that I drove Barbara, all that period, apart from a few little incidents which I'll tell you about, there was such a silence. It was not one of those awkward silences, uneasy silence. It was, I felt, that's all I can say, of course, I felt so happy just being there driving. Intent, yes, I was very much alert, but I was also very content, very happy to be there with the Lord sitting alongside me. Although, to be honest, I didn't think of that in those terms. To me, Barbara, yes, I knew intellectually, I accepted intellectually that he was God in human form. But
there's an enormous gap as far as I can see now between having those words and accepting them and holding to them, and yet being aware in a deeper sense, in a deeper part of one's being, and as it were having some degree of understanding. Perhaps that would understanding. It's certainly not an important. In a way, it doesn't matter, because one is simply content to be aware of him, to be able to say his name and to think of him, to be able to visualize him, that in itself, to call on him. But anyway, so we okay. All I can tell you is that there was that degree of inner solid contentment in just driving him and being with him. That was sufficient to itself. I could have just gone on. We arrive at Beacon Hill, and I backed the car as had been arranged into the rock ledge that's in front of the house, in front of the front door, and Barbara got out. So the kookaburras in the distance sort of agreed with me talking about Maya Baba. So Baba got out, and although it wasn't scheduled, it wasn't meant to be, Baba stood on a little raised section of the rock, a few inches, 4 or 5 inches higher than, well, perhaps not even that, but a little raised piece of rock, and he stood on that, and it so happened that everyone somehow appeared and was embraced. That was the beginning embrace, and it was the beginning, you could, of a most wonderful sunlit, joyous time with Baba. It was interesting. The days were sunny, even though the mornings and evenings were cold, and there was during the night, as Baba predicted one evening, there was a cold wind that came during the night, but the days were sunny, and that seemed to be the absolute theme, feeling of his visit. When he said, "I've come to plant the seed of love in this country," he demonstrated what love was. He gave himself to us in such a loving, natural way. Must emphasize how natural he was with us in so many little ways, in the whole tone of